when it came to finals, he was sitting right on the ground level watching all the chorus. We get to the point where there's like a big timpani feature. It's like timpani and brass only. I was like, I can't look at Vic. I just can't look at him while I'm doing this because he's sitting right in front of me. And I finished the ballad and I was like, all right, I'm going to look up. And then he just looks at me with a big ear-to-ear smile and give me like 2 thumbs up. And I was like, all right, I don't care what happens for the rest of this show. I got 2 thumbs up from Vic Firth. The timpani could be set on fire at this point. I don't care.
Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of July 22, 2024. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a new band director at a storied university, a copyright-cleared performance of a new band work, a deceptively named band, and I have a conversation with a percussionist who's got a resume longer than this podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. Full disclosure, I only finished production work on this podcast very late on Sunday evening. If you're listening the day this episode drops, that means mere hours ago. It wasn't procrastination. It's just that a portion of the episode contains information and material that I knew I wasn't going to be able to capture until around supper time Sunday. It's a time travel-y episode for me. I had to drop in some audio from yesterday, but I recorded the trio section interview 3 weeks ago. Now, if I hadn't told you that, would you have spotted it? I definitely hope not. And while I wouldn't want to make a habit of uploading episode audio on that kind of screaming deadline, sometimes events happen when they happen. And to a slightly lesser degree, next week's episode will come together just in time, as I'll talk about briefly in the coda section this week. See? Time travel. So, put fresh batteries in your Dr. Beat, and away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Howard University has named Chancellor Mills as Director of Bands in the Howard University Chadwick A. Boseman College of Fine Arts. Mills will direct the Showtime Marching Band, Concert Band, and Pep Band. He has been serving as the Assistant Band Director of the Marching Band for the past 2 years and as a musical arranger and drill designer. Mills began his teaching career in 2001 at Lutcher High School in St. James Parish, Louisiana. In 2006, he was appointed Director of Bands at Banneker High School in South Fulton County, Georgia. In 2009, he was named as the first band director of the newly constructed Langston Hughes High School in Fairburn, Georgia. That band performed during the Sugar Bowl and Champs Sports Ball halftime shows. Mills earned a Bachelor of Music Education degree from Southern University, where he was a member of the Human Jukebox Marching Band. His Master of Music Education degree is from Vandercook College of Music in Chicago. Mills is a member of the National Association for Music Educators, as well as the Kappa Kappa Psi and Omega Psi Phi fraternities. Dateline, Hopkinton, Massachusetts. Yesterday, July 21st, the Hopkinton Community Summer Band celebrated its 20th anniversary with a concert conducted by last week's trio section guest Craig Hay, as well as by Hopkinton music educators Caitlin McDonald and Dave Purdy. The concert was held on the Hopkinton Town Common. Selections included marches, medleys, and, as discussed in last week's podcast episode, a commissioned work based on the early American hymn tune Hopkinton, or at least one early American hymn tune that was named Hopkinton. There were several. The concert concluded with the summer band's traditional closer, the classic Harold Walters creation, Instant Concert. And that's news and notes from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. After this quick break, more on that Hopkinton concert. This is BandWagon. Let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, a follow-up to last week's conversation with Craig Hay and to this week's news item about the Hopkinton Community Summer Band, which Craig and Caitlin and Dave ably led in performance yesterday. It occurred to me in listening back to last week's episode that the only thing we didn't do was to give you an idea of what that commissioned work, Hopkinton Rising, sounded like, at least apart from our verbal descriptions of the source material. And I didn't give you any audio sense, but I certainly didn't leave that out because of copyright concerns. Long story short, it's a new work to which I own the rights, based on a piece of music written in the 1700s, so no licensing concerns there. And I could have played the computer-generated rendering from the MuseScore music notation software that I use to arrange and compose music. I use MuseScore version 3, and I'm on my way to upgrading to version 4, which has a library of even more realistic instrument sounds. But even so, as remarkable as currently available technology is, I prefer to hear humans playing band music whenever possible. Which is, of course, why this podcast's incidental music is all generated by Mr. Computerized MuseScore app. Yeah, move on. So now, here is live audio of the world premiere performance of Hopkinton Rising from last night's Hopkinton Community Summer Band concert, about 12 hours ago, give or take. A little tiny technical note, there was a water fountain not terribly far from where the band was playing, and you will need to spend the next 4.5 minutes listening around the otherwise soothing sounds of cascading water. My apologies in advance. I'm very much looking forward to the video recording that Hopkinton's television station HCAM made, and I suspect you will look forward to it too. But these are the challenges that often accompany live outdoor music. We know that very well. In any case, hope you enjoy. if you have any questions about the piece, drop me an email, and I will be only too happy to respond. At least if you have questions that weren't answered in last week's trio section. And in just a moment, this week's trio section. Okay, let's shift gears and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I'm pleased to be joined by a gentleman who has described himself as rock star adjacent. I'll just read a few selected items from his official bio here. He's recorded on Grammy-nominated record albums. He's worked with Madonna. He's worked with other world-class musicians, including Mary J. Blige. He's played in the house band for American Idol. He's been featured in Modern Drummer and Latin Beat magazines. He was a member of the Cadets Drum and Bugle Corps, whoever that is. He was an original cast member of the show Blast. And how in the world do I know this gentleman? Because our Venn diagram circles overlap in the little town of Amherst, Massachusetts, with an asterisk, because of course that's why. Please help me welcome to the program, Damon Grant. Damon.
Thanks for having me.
I love that you were willing to come on the podcast here, and it's nice to meet you.
Virtually nice to meet you as well.
This is a case of me having heard your name over and over again in the context of the UMass Bands and one particular other project, Blast, but never actually having had the chance to interact with you at all, because, let's be honest, I don't run in the same circles as you, certainly at nearly the altitude that your circles tend to inhabit. I'm looking forward to where this conversation goes.
Where do you want to start?
I usually start, it's a kind of an artificial construction, but it's a place to begin with a few questions which have answers that could be dragged out of a resume. And the first one of them, which has been totally given away, particularly if you have a look at the episode artwork, what's your primary instrument? And this may have a multiple answer. I'm not even sure.
So I consider myself a percussionist first. Basically anything you can hit, scratch, or shake. What I get called for the most is currently hand percussion in a pop setting, which would be congas, bongos, timbales, an assortment of handheld instruments, but also the use of electronics. There's many different types of sample pads where you can load sounds up into it. The one that I just happen to use is by the Roland Company. That's the first thing I get called for. After that, I have a hybrid percussion setup based around the cajon. That I get called for a lot with like singer-songwriters or very intimate settings. Is that all I get called for? No, but that's what I get called for the most. And a lot of times it's because somebody sees you do something and then they assume that that's all you do. They don't necessarily dig deeper and be like, oh, well, this guy can also play mallets. Oh, he can also play timpani. So then that's what you keep getting called for. And if you want to get called for something else, you have to take it upon yourself to showcase these other avenues of what you're able to do. But, for the most part, I'm okay being called for whatever they see me doing. Like right now, a lot of it has been pop oriented or pop adjacent, which is great. I like that. Primarily, my job is called a side person or a session musician, whether that session is one live event or an entire tour, or if that session is one recording session or an entire album or whatever. But I'm not in a band, quote unquote. I define being in a band as being part of like a board of directors where it's the same people every time. Whereas if you're a side person like me, I get hired by different artists or different musical contractors or whatever for however many engagements they want to hire me for. I'm more of like a free agent or a 1099 subcontracted employee.
So moving backwards in time a little bit, what got you into playing percussion?
I think it was because my friends were playing percussion. Now, when I was, 2, I got a Muppet drum set, which was like a toy. My mom told me that like I would put my drumsticks like through the head every time. And that's only because the drumsticks were like a hard yellow plastic and the drum heads were just paper. So every like third day, my stick would go through the drum head and then I would retape the drum head and then I would do it again to last another 2 to 3 days and stick would go through. So at some point, the drum heads were just unsalvageable and they finally like got rid of it. But The Muppet Show and Sesame Street were the two shows that I watched obsessively. I would drag my drum set and put it right in front of the TV and I would try and play along. My mom's best friend taught piano at a private school and I started taking piano lessons with her. In third grade, you can actually get an instrument. Band instruments weren't allowed yet. You can only take string instruments because those came in half sizes and quarter sizes and three-quarter or whatever. So I wanted to play the bass because I spent a lot of time listening to my dad's jazz records and my mom's Motown records. And I would listen to these records obsessively, and I would read all the liner notes when I started to learn how to read. I got to the where I could choose an instrument, and I was like, I want to play the drums. And they're like, can't play the drums because no band instruments yet. You can only play a string instrument. It's like, well, then I want to play the bass. And they're like, you're too short. Here's a cello. So they gave me a cello, and I was still like tiny. And they're like, man, this thing, you can't even get it onto the bus. Why don't we switch you to like the violin? My grandmother gave my mother a violin that my great grandfather had in Jamaica. And then that's what I was taking to like my string classes. And still taking piano lessons on the side, but I would play this violin. Like I wasn't really into it as a violin. I would turn it sideways and try and play it like a guitar. And then they were finally like, are you sure this is what you want? All at the time, like I'm making new friends. We're skateboarding. Like that was the cool thing to do. Finally, when you get to middle school, you can do band instruments. And that's when I switched back to drums. It was mostly because that's what my friends were doing. And I just wanted to hang out with them. Then I realized really quickly that it wasn't cool if you were the person that couldn't do whatever the assignment was. So then it was like, okay, I got to go home and I got to like work on this. And then we all started taking lessons on drums. As I'm taking these music lessons, I'm also being introduced to melodic percussion because a lot of it was set up like the piano. In middle schools, when you also start to do some marching activity for like, I think it was the Memorial Day parade was like the one thing that the area middle and high schools would do. The place where I grew up was Norwalk, Connecticut. That's where most of my formative years were. In Norwalk, there was a music store called Norwalk Music that the Spermuli family owned. What I found out later, a rarity for most of the country, but not for certain areas in the Northeast. What I mean by that is in Fairfield County, Connecticut, a little bit of Westchester County, the first part of Long Island, and parts of northern New Jersey. A lot of the musicians that were crushing it in New York City would then reside in these suburbs. So these areas that I just named would have these amazing musicians just teaching at the local music store. So I'm going into the music store and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just taking lessons with this person, not knowing all of the people I'm walking by. And there's a running joke amongst certain musicians that I know. They call it the CT Mafia, the Connecticut Mafia, because there's a lot of musicians in Connecticut that would then go into New York City, play, and then go home and reside in the suburbs. I forget who started it, but somebody was like, yeah, it's because you guys be coming down from the suburbs and you'd be murdering these gigs, the Connecticut Mafia, and then you go back to front yards and gardens and space and stuff. Now, there were other musicians that I crossed paths with as a young musician, but also later on that were from Connecticut. And we all were like, oh yeah, I remember you, one of the most famous being John Mayer from Fairfield, Connecticut. I mean, just in Norwalk alone, we had Jason Goldman, who's the head of the jazz department at USC, Mark Small, who toured with Michael Bublé, Gerald Miles, who played with a bunch of Cirque du Soleil shows. Up in Stratford, there was Javier Colon. Back in Fairfield, Ian McHugh, who started this band called the Bomb Squad, Stephen Kellogg, Michael Bolton's in Westport, Diana Ross lived in Greenwich. And this is just Fairfield County, Connecticut.
You're tossing names off. I'm thinking, okay, so it's in the hierarchy, it's New Orleans, Memphis, Nashville, and Fairfield.
Well, no, but yeah, so I think it was around 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. I saw my first live concert, which my dad took me and some of my friends to, and it was Tito Puente. The first live concert I'm seeing is Tito Puente. So my first thought is I had no idea there could be that many drummers in one band, because there was a conga player, there was a timbale player, there was a bongo player, and then there was with the singers playing like guiro and maraca. And then if Tito was going to play a solo, there would be somebody else that would play a second set of timbales, like holding down the bell while he was just, there was a lot going on. So like that was just mind blowing. As I got closer to high school, there was a friend of mine, Britt Brito, who played in this drum corps called the Hawthorne Caballeros. His dad played contrabass for the young kids, that is a tuba. And Britt was in the pit and then eventually in the snare line. But Britt was one of the people that actually introduced me to the first set of hand percussion instruments that I played. My best friend Gerald, who I mentioned earlier, Gerald Miles, he was snare drum and drum set. And his dad at one point played with James Brown. But Britt was the first person to introduce me to actually playing on Latin percussion. Like he had a set of congas and he had bongos and timbales. And it was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And seeing that Tito Puente concert was kind of how I got into learning this stuff. And when I got to high school, my band director was very adamant about, if you play drum set, you're going to be 1 out of 1,000,000. But if you can play all these other percussion instruments too, you're going to be like 1 out of 10. So he had a really strong drive on making sure that I could play all the orchestral stuff. At first, it was Gerald and I, and later Britt, who would play in all these ensembles, not just in the school, from the marching band to the concert band, to the wind ensemble, to the orchestra, to the pit orchestra for the play, to the jazz big band, to the jazz combo, but also outside, like the community band in Fairfield County. And then, making sure that we're taking these private lessons from these world-renowned musicians. He was relentless about, like, if you want to be a professional, this is what you need to do. I don't want to hear that you're tired. This is if this is your goal, this is what you need to do. And you need to be able to do it all well. And there was this one teacher, Ken Ross, who he played on the Westchester Broadway Theater. And he really kicked the door down for me with learning Afro-Cuban stuff. I know he did this with other students as well. Ken was spending a lot of time at the Harbor Boys School, which was in Spanish Harlem. Harbor Boys School was a place where you could go and take Afro-Cuban lessons. It was also the place where a lot of these Latin bands, like Tito Puente, for example, they would rehearse and then go play at places like the Palladium or the Copacabana or whatever. They would rehearse at the Harbor Boys School. Ken was there religiously, like taking lessons on like all kinds of instruments. Like Ken was responsible for introducing me to bata because he was studying with a legend, Milton Cardona. And he's like, oh yeah, Damon, you got to come check out Milton, man. He's great. And I was like, okay, let's do it. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but bata drums are like a very religious drum originally from West Africa, but also made popular in Cuba. One of the people that Ken also became friends with was a drummer named Horacio El Negro Hernandez. Negro left Cuba and moved to Italy. And then after Italy, moved to New York City. This is the time where he was spending a lot of time at the Harbor Boys School. So Ken befriended him. Negro wanted to write a book, which is now out. The book is called Conversations in Clave. He was telling Ken about the book, and Ken's like, oh, let me help you organize your ideas.
So you're dealing with a lot of role models in residence there.
Yeah, well, simultaneously, I'm in high school doing all these ensembles, and I ended up doing the marching band. The marching band had instructors. Some of them were involved in drum corps. So I started at the Hawthorne Caballeros. I actually then went to the Boston Crusaders, and then I went to the Cadets of Bergen County. I think I did about 7 or 8 years total, which is not always something like me. I'm a person of color. That's not always accessible for people. Like doing marching band for as long as I did, which was in high school and college, and then doing just shy of a decade in drum corps. That has a lot of restrictions for people of color, one of them being money.
I've very often gone to all-state concerts, and in the program they will list the names of the participating musicians and where they come from. There are a lot more Lexingtons and Foxboroughs and Belmonts and Amhersts and Longmeadows than there are Chicopes and Hollyoaks. And one of the areas that I have thought about is access to private lessons, unless it's Fairfield County, in which case apparently all bets are off. But
well, I mean, at that time, that was a very special time. I don't know if Fairfield County is still like a powerhouse like that, but at the time, mid 90s, everybody was taking lessons from great teachers. And
sorry, I made a swerve away from your high school band.
So back to in the marching band, and Jack Mansinger was one of the instructors. And Jack had gone on and he had done the Connecticut Hurricanes, and then he did the cadets, and then came back to teach the high school I was at. So he was ahead of me. So now I'm in high school. He introduced us to the cadets, and that's when I switched over from senior corps. I did Boston Crusaders first, and then I did the cadets. And Jack has been a good guiding light for me because I also ended up going to UMass for college. I had applied to a bunch of different schools. I mean, the standard quote unquote music school powerhouses that you're supposed to apply to. It was like Ithaca, Indiana, Miami. When I told my private instructor, Dave Dion, that one of the schools was UMass Amherst, he was like, oh, I'm finishing up my master's there right now. And Jack was finishing his undergrad. So he told my parents, he's like, listen, this coming weekend or whatever, there's a bunch of concerts going on. I have to go up there anyway. Why don't I take Damon with me and I'll show him around the campus. I'll show him you'll get to see his ensembles and you don't have to make the drive up there right away. My parents are like, you're going to drive him up there and show him around and we can just stay here and take him up at a later point. Take him as long as you want. This the story. This right here was like a musical trajectory. When things kind of took like a sharp turn was this trip up to UMass. I was riding with Dave Dion in his red Ford Ranger. And the whole time he had one cassette in the truck. It was Michelle Camilo, On Fire. And so we're just listening to this 2 hours up to UMass. And then on the way home, 2 hours back, this is the only cassette that's in there over and over again, the whole album front to back. It was a clear plastic cassette and the words were written on it with like a white ink, but they were all rubbed off because it was so worn out. So I had no idea what album this was and who was on it. It just said Michelle Camilo. After this, there was a local music store that sold albums, cassettes, and CDs, Sally's Place. So I went in the store and I was like, Sally, I just went up to college to check it out. I was probably like a junior in high school at this point. And I listened to this album by Michelle Camilo, but I don't know which one. She's like, okay, let's go. Walks me over to the section, pull out all of Michelle Camilo albums, and we open them up one by one. We just listen to them. And I finally was like, this is the one. She's like, oh, well, yeah, it's On Fire. This album. She's like, here you go. Why don't you? So I bought it, and I'm reading the liner notes, and I'm reading there's 3 drummers on it. It was like Marvin Smitty Smith, Dave Weckl. But anyway, so like this changed the trajectory because now I'm in college, and I'm diving deep into the Afro-Cuban world. I'm looking up all these albums, looking at the credits, following who I can study and listen to. This guy, Kit Carlson, who I was in school with, got this flyer and it said like Michelle Camilo playing at like, I think it was Scullers Jazz Club in Boston. Mm-hmm. And he's like, dude, Michelle Camilo is playing in Boston. We are going. And I was like, yes. And we got in his car. We got to like Palmer and we got a flat tire. And Kit was like, oh, this is not stopping us. We're still going. So we put on the donut and the donut was like, don't drive more than like 300 miles. Yeah, we're like, we're going to Boston and back on this donut. We're not missing the show. So we got to Boston, we saw the show, and afterwards I go up to talk to whoever. I was like, I got to go meet this drummer. And I was like, what's your name? He's like, oh, Negro, Horacio Hernandez, Negro. And I was like, oh my God, Ken Ross. I was like, I've been studying your stuff. And he's like, oh, Ken, I love Ken. And he saw me like holding a tape recorder because I was so in shock. And he's like, did you record the show? And I was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. And I was like, yes. And he's like, can you send me a copy? And he gave me his home address, which at the time was in New Jersey. He's like, please come over to the house when you get back from school. I want to hear the tape and everything. So yeah, that was when Negro and I's friendship began. Mind you, this Afro-Cuban study is going on while I switched over from music ed. I went in as music ed because that's what my band director was like, you got to be music ed so you have something to fall back on. Spring semester of my freshman year, Jack Mansinger was finishing up his degree and he was the librarian for UMass because he got the key to where all the files were, which is the only space that was big enough for him to put his 5-octave marimba in. So he could practice at all times whenever he wanted. So he pulls me aside in that room, the library, and he's like, why are you music ed? And I was like, well, it's because what, they told me I should do to fall back on. He's like, well, is that what you want to do? I was like, no, I want to play music for a living, like perform. And he's like, well, why don't you go switch to be a performance major? And I was like, well, what if I don't make it? And he's like, well, right now you're preparing yourself to fail. And he's like, if you just spent 100% of your efforts on what you wanted to do, I'm sure you'd have a better shot at it. And then if it didn't work out, you still have plenty of time to regroup and figure something else out. He's like, but don't half-ass it,
because it's what you think you should do.
Right. So immediately I went upstairs the next day to Helen Boyden in the music office. And I was like, can I switch to performance? And she's like, yeah. So she switched me to performance, but I didn't realize it was classical performance. So now the stuff I'm having to learn is like excerpts. So I'm learning like marimba literature and snare drum etudes and timpani etudes and orchestral excerpts, Porgy and Bess and Romeo and Juliet and all this stuff. And it was like 3 a.m. I was trying to memorize the Magic Flute excerpt on the orchestra bells. And I just snapped. I was like, I can't do this anymore. This is not what I want. So I went upstairs the next day, Helen Boyd, and I'm back. Do you have any other performance degree? She's like, jazz performance. Or at the title was African American Music and Jazz. And I was like, just put me in that. She's like, well, do you want to know so you don't have to switch again what the requirement? I was like, no, I don't care. As long as it's not Porgy and Bess and the Magic Flute anymore, I will switch. So it was jazz performance. It was great because then I got to study with Jeff Holmes. I got to study with Yusef Lateef. And then still doing the drum corps in the summers. At this point, I'm in the cadets. 1996 was a big year for the cadets because we got to go to the Olympics.
If you know, you know.
That was cool because we did the closing ceremony and there was a big celebration and we went in at night because they had the bomb scare. Right. So they had to go have the dogs sniff all of the trucks that were coming in. And we had the bright idea in the pit. So now I marched at UMass, I marched bass drum. Because I was
gonna check in and ask. Yeah,
I loved bass drum. I love the fact that it was a cohesive unit where like you had to play a small part and that you was a team. And then in drum corps, I did the front ensemble. At first, I wanted to do bass drum, but every time I would go for bass drum, they'd be like, "Well, we have this one guy who he can only do bass drum, whereas you can also do the pit stuff." So I was like, "Fine." And then it was like more fun because like now I don't have to do drill rehearsal.
Let me get you back to the Olympics.
The closing ceremonies thing, we got there the night early. The dogs had to smell the trucks. I had relatives in Atlanta. So we're on the corner and we're just near this like bodega. And I call like my aunt or my uncle. I don't remember. I called them and I was like, yeah, yo, I'm in Atlanta. And they're like, where are you at? And I was like, yo, I'm right by the stadium because we got to like they got to smell the truck and make sure there's no bomb or whatever. They're like, where? Because apparently the stadium is like right next to the hood. So they're like, where? And I was like, yo, we're on the corner of this and that. And they're like, yo, you better get out of there. Like, that is not a safe place to be. And I was like, well, this is where they're having us wait. We were literally sitting on the curb.
The Olympics are telling us we're supposed to be here.
Yeah. But we're sitting on the curb and like right across the street is like homeless people. It was definitely not a safe place to be. But we did get a tour of the stadium at night. We got to see the torch, got all the stuff. And then we got in the next day to rehearse. And then we had time off. And we got to walk around the compound and see all these other acts that are getting ready for. And one of the acts was this skateboard BMX thing. And I used to skateboard.
We've come full circle, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I go over to it. I'm like, I'm going to check this out. And I got to meet some of the legends of the legends in skateboarding. Tony Hawk, Danny Way, Lance Mountain, and Steve Caballero. I didn't have anything other than like we found a Post-it on the ground and they all signed this Post-it for me. I still have this Post-it somewhere in a box. But I was like, 12-year-old Damon is freaking out right now. But then like we do the Olympics and there were other celebrities like Stevie Wonder was there, Gloria Estefan, Boyz II Men. President Clinton was sitting like right in front of us. This was like a party that we shouldn't have been at.
Yeah.
But it was also in the middle of a really hectic travel weekend. So I didn't register how important that weekend was until like the season was over and I got to like actually get some sleep. Because we had a show in Clifton, New Jersey, where we went on first. We did the show. We didn't even stay. As soon as we were done with our show, we got on the buses and we just drove to Atlanta. And we did the whole thing within like in less than 48 hours, the rehearsal, the show, the taping. And then as soon as we were done, we got right back on the buses and drove right back up to Allentown for DCI East. It was a rough weekend. But yeah, that was the cadets. Fast forward, I get out of the cadets. My last year, I was the drum major, which was great because I learned a lot more about the ensemble and how to run an ensemble. Tom Unks was huge with that. And so was Matt Harloff. Because I wasn't actually going to do my age out year, but they brought me into a room and they're like, we'd love for you to be the drum major. They were like, we heard you aren't going to march. And I was like, yeah, I wanted to play bass drum, but all 5 of the bass drummers from last year are coming back and they're my friends. And I've pretty much gotten everything I'm going to get out of being in a front ensemble. So I'm just going to go do something else. And they're like, well, we're actually considering you to be one of the drum majors because you've been in this corps for so many years. You know, how are you with conducting? And I was like, well, I took a conducting class at UMass. And they're like, how'd you do? And it's like, I passed. I had like a C minus. Then Matt Harloff spoke up and he's like, well, I can teach a monkey to conduct. We want you for the other qualities. We want you for your leadership, that you've been here. You know how the organization is supposed to run. People respect you. You understand, you know, the staff. Like there's a whole bunch of other reasons why we want you to be a drum major aside from conducting. So I had conducting lessons with Matt. Like when people would go off and do their like sectionals, me and Matt would go find a room and he would help me conduct and show me how to cue, cut off, understand how to conduct with the brass. Cause I've always been with percussion. And, you know, you move your hand, percussion, the attack is immediate. With brass, they have to breathe and it's more confident if you look at them and like all this other stuff that I had no idea about. I was like, oh, wow, this is great. Fast forward, I get out of the cadets, I'm back at school, finished up my degree, and Tom Hannum approaches me about, hey, we're doing this thing. It's kind of like the Star of Indiana Brass Theater, but it's going in a different direction. I would love to see if you would be interested in it. And one of the positions that we think that you would help us out is your strength in Afro-Cuban percussion. I was like, yeah, cool, audition. I don't even think he ever watched my audition tape, but I think it was like the formality of just having me do it. I'm 96% positive he never watched that tape. We moved out to Indiana in Bloomington for a bunch of months and we rehearsed the show there. And it was all kinds of stuff from the marching stuff where we did like Medea and we did the Afro-Cuban stuff from Marimba Spiritual and Malagueña. We did orchestral stuff. We did jazz stuff. It was like, you name it. So now we go over to London and now we're living in London and we're playing at the Apollo Hammersmith, which to me was huge because Led Zeppelin played there. So like in the middle of the stage, I could be like, this is where John Bonham sat right here. But yeah, we did the show. I loved living there. Another life-changing moment was the fact that I had a British girlfriend at the time. She was a jazz singer and she found a flyer and she was like, I think you would like this. And the flyer read, Don Elias and Friends. Don Elias was percussionist for Weather Report. Before that, he was a percussionist for Miles Davis. So I was like, yo, I'm way into this. And the listing it was Don Elias, Alex Acuna, also from Weather Report, Giovanni Hidalgo, and Steve Berrios of Jerry Gonzalez and Fort Apache Band that were all on percussion. Blown away by the band. Followed them to their hotel, which was like right next door to where the venue was. And I had to meet Giovanni because he was the greatest of all time. I'd been listening to him for, at this point, probably a decade. We talked at the bar for a while, and then he checked out my hands. He had me play some stuff on the bar. He played some stuff, and he's like, man, you should come study with me. I was like, I would love to. He's like, yeah, I'm in Orlando. I was like, bet, I'll find you. He's like, great. And we left, and we're on the tube going back to like my flat. My girlfriend goes, did you get any of his information? I was like, no. I was so excited. She's like, well, how are you going to find him? I was like, I have no idea, but I'm going to figure it out. My friend Gerald, I had grown up with, he had transferred from the Hart School of Music to UMass. So I hit him up and I was like, yo, I just met Giovanni, this and that. And he's like, and I was like, but after this show ends in London, I'm going to come back to UMass, but I really want to go study with Giovanni, but he's in Orlando. He's like, yo, me and his roommate at the time, Chris Queenan, had just gotten a gig at the Magic Kingdom in Orlando. He was like, we're going to go down there and we're going to scope it out. And he's like, if you get a gig at Disney, you'll be in Orlando. It'll be easier to find Giovanni. So show ended. I came back, told my parents I wanted to move to Orlando. They're like, well, if you move, you actually have to take courses that will transfer up to UMass. So you can, because I had stopped school so I could go do this gig blast. So my agreement with my parents was no matter what happens with the show afterwards, I'm going to finish my degree. So like, if you go to Orlando, you're going to have to take some community college classes that transfer and you have to get a job. So I started out by just working at the Rock and Roller Coaster, the Aerosmith Rock and Roller Coaster, like literally putting people into a roller coaster. While I was doing this roller coaster thing and taking community college classes, an audition opened up for this group called the Village Beatniks, which was just 5 percussionists at Animal Kingdom. So I ended up getting on that as a sub in the 2-day band. And then I was also playing at Bongo's Cuban Cafe in downtown Disney and the Latin Quarter over at Universal City Walk. And then one of the guys that was in the Village Beatniks, he grew up with Giovanni. So he gave me his number. I started taking lessons with Giovanni. When the community college classes ended, I told him I was going to come back up to finish my degree in New York and everything. And he was like, well, when you get to New York, you got to look up my friend Richie Flores. And I was like, bet. He's like, Richie plays with Eddie Palmieri. So go back to UMass to finish my degree. It's just my senior year. One of my part-time jobs was being an usher at the Fine Arts Center concert hall. And there's, like Buena Vista Social Club was one of the groups that came through. The one that I went to go see was Eddie Palmieri. And I was like, oh, Giovanni told me that Richie Flores, I have to go find him. So I went to go see Eddie Palmieri. Richie Flores was not on the gig. It was another guy named Renato Toms. And Renato was like, I know Richie. Here, take my number. When you come back to New York, I'll get you hooked up with him. Finished my degree. I moved back to Connecticut temporarily. But then I also started subletting my friend Mark Small's apartment in Queens. So anyway, Renato introduced me to Richie. I started studying with Richie, and he introduced me to a whole nother world of just legendary Afro-Cuban percussionists. And that's when I started getting my endorsements. The first one I got was with Latin Percussion. Then I got one with Vic Firth. And there's this interesting story with Vic Firth. So I got signed from Vic Firth, and he was there on the day of my signing. And he was like, man, he had known about me through drum corps. And he's like, anything I can ever do, you let me know, I'll help you out. But I just remember he came and did not like a clinic, but like, a Q&A session with the cadets drumline. He's like, all right, any other questions out there? And I raised my hand. This is 1998, the year that the cadets won the championship. I was one of the featured timpani players. So anyway, any other questions? I raised my hand to Vic, and I was like, yeah. Because people were asking him about like, what's it like, Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Stick organization, all this stuff. And my question was, how do you get your teeth so white? Because he had like the whitest teeth I've ever seen. And he's like, what do you mean? I brush them, with some other expletives in there, because that's how he talks. I was like, well, he's like, you got some white teeth too. And we took a picture. And from what I understand from Chuck Moulton is the picture of us was on his desk for a little while. But anyway, when it came to finals, he was sitting right on the ground level watching all the chorus. We get to the point where there's like a big timpani feature. It's like timpani and brass only. I was like, I can't look at Vic. I just can't look at him while I'm doing this, because he's sitting right in front of me. And I finished the ballad, and I was like, all right, I'm going to look up. And then he just looks at me with a big ear-to-ear smile and give me like 2 thumbs up. And I was like, all right, I don't care what happens for the rest of this show. I got 2 thumbs up from Vic Firth. The timpani could be set on fire at this point. I don't care. Like I'm good. Vic Firth gave me 2 thumbs up. So fast forward, I started getting my endorsements, Latin Percussion, Vic Firth, eventually Zildjian cymbals, Remo drumheads, and like that helped start shaping my career, because I was doing a lot of stuff in the Afro-Cuban and jazz world in New York. And then it started to shift a little bit when I started doing the Bomb Squad stuff. And that was because of Brad Mason. We played in a Latin band together. And he was like, I play in this funk rock band, and the percussionist is leaving to move to San Francisco for a while. Can you help finish the album? That's what it was. I was like, yeah, sure. So I just recorded on the album. And then the band leader asked me to actually play some shows with them. And then he asked me formally to be in the band. That was with the Bomb Squad. And I started saying, oh, well, this is like where I started, like with pop music. But now I'm incorporating all of this Afro-Cuban and jazz orchestral knowledge I had into the playing that I have in the pop world. And then this band started taking off. They eventually won an American Music Award, and we started touring a lot. And one of the biggest tours that we ended up doing was we were on this thing called the Mayer Craft, which John Mayer was the headliner, because Brad had gotten called to be in John Mayer's band at the time. So he left temporarily from the Bomb Squad to play with John. That was like a reacquainting, like, oh yeah, we know each other from way back. Like, I would not say that John Mayer is like my friend, but he is a distant acquaintance. But I'm a lot closer with the people in his band. So like when we were doing the Bomb Squad stuff, there was a singer named Javier Colon, also from Connecticut, who he won the first season of The Voice. Javier was subbing some shows for us, and this is right when Brad had gotten called to go with John, and Bomb Squad played at the Iron Horse in Northampton, and then we had a day off, and that next day off, Glenn and I, the percussionist and drum set player, were doing a day of percussion masterclass at UMass for Tom Hannum. Tom is like my second dad. Like, I still, to this day, he still looks out for me, and we still check in, and he's still giving me advice and stuff. So the amount of admiration and gratitude I have for him is immense. All right, so now we're doing the master class at UMass, and I get a text from Brad. He's like, hey, man, I saw that you're in the Amherst, Massachusetts area. How long are you going to be there? We're like, well, we just did our gig, and the day of percussion's coming up the next day, And he's like, well, do you want to stay one more day? Because John Mayer is playing at the Mullen Center. I was like, yeah, sure, let's do that. And afterwards, we go backstage, and Brad introduced me to the band, and I meet David Ryan Harris and JJ Johnson for the first time. This is like 2007. These two guys like kind of changed my life, not just because they were two black guys in a mostly white band, but we just connected over just music stuff and, I mean, for lack of a better term, black stuff. Because we were like, the three of us were like in a black space. Like we could talk about stuff that you can't really talk about and have the same understanding. Somebody who's not. We kind of connected, and then we found out that we got the Mayorcraft thing. So there's a company called Sixth Man. They ended up starting this thing where they do like rock and roll cruises. Now it's blown up and it's huge. All kinds of themed cruises where they take over a cruise ship. The first one I played on was the Mayorcraft. The Bomb Squad played on it, and John Mayer was the headline and picked all the other bands. I got to reacquaint with David Ryan Harris and JJ Johnson, and we spent like the whole week together hanging out. The two of them have been like older brothers to me in career decisions and helping me get situated. David produced an album that I did. Like these two guys, I can bounce anything off of them and they'll give it to me straight. My career has taken off because of some of their guidance. Fast forward, Bomb Squad ended up breaking up. And that actually was really good, because if I was still in that band, I don't know that I would have explored all the other stuff that I'm into now. So it gave me the opportunity to be like, all right, well, I have to make a living. I have loans that I need to pay off. I'm out of school. I now have no gig. I need to pay rent. That was huge in me figuring out like the next steps. So.
And now, dear listener, a bandwagon first. My first cliffhanger.
Mr. Worf. Fire.
My session with Damon Grant will be concluded in episode 24, 2 weeks from now. Why? Because the stories are way too good, and if you thought Damon dropped band stories in this episode, even amidst all the pop percussion career origin stories, just you wait. Or are there bandwagon band stories to come? For the moment, I'll step away briefly and then return with this week's Dogfight. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight would be another band-related internet rabbit hole of the week. If the band I'm thinking of had much of an internet presence, which they don't really, it's the Fitchburg Military Band, and we'll start right there with the unusual details. 2/3 of its name are correct. The band is indeed a band, and it's based in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, but it's not military. To explain, it's a professional union band that has been around since the time of the Civil War. It appears to be the oldest band in central Massachusetts, although it's not clear whether it's been active for the whole time between then and now. The band was formed in January of 1868, just after the Civil War, with 8 members. It was called the Musical Club, and it did not perform in public. But a few months later, the club had grown to 33 members and was renamed the Fitchburg Cornet Band. They performed in public for the first time in May of 1868. They now offer free concerts from the bandstand on the shore of Mirror Lake in Fitchburg's Cogs Hall Park on 2 or 3 Sunday afternoons every summer. Their conductor has been Bill Williams, but when I went to hear them play on Sundays, July 7th and 14th, they were conducted by David Bailey, whom some of you might perhaps know as the longtime conductor of the Neshoba Symphonic Band. And now, here's a sample of the Fitchburg Military Band. After this quick pause, I'll finish this episode with a preview of the next one. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the coda. For the coda this week, earlier in this episode I described a little bit of midnight oil burning that went on in the effort to include a little bit of late-breaking content. I don't anticipate cutting it quite so close next week, but I am looking forward to bringing a little bit of relatively hot off the presses audio to you from my annual week on the instructional staff of the George N. Parks Drum Major Academy. More details and descriptions and stories then. If you're a regular BandWagon listener, you will have heard more than a few passing references to this student leadership clinic. I've been looking forward to expanding on those references in this podcast space, and yep, next week will be a logical moment to do that. I've been an instructor with DMA for 1 or 2 weeks every summer since 1999, give or take a COVID year, and also the summer after that, where I was still feeling a bit too much pandemic PTSD to dive back into the fray quite yet. So, this will be my 24th go-round, and you know what they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In this case, in a good way. I have no doubt that I'll bring back a few new stories at the end of next week. But next Saturday is going to be a busy day here at BandWagon World Headquarters. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at our website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback. Let me know what you like and what you think might change. You can do that using our email address, heybandwagon@yahoo.com. Or leave us a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that we do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to our news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, Damon Grant, can be found in our show notes. Please share this show on social media with someone you think maybe hasn't heard it yet, and thank you for that, because word of mouth is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with us every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold, or are free. And please rate and review. It really helps other people to find the show. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton. Front of the bus. Middle of the bus. Back of the bus.